Thank you very much, Phil. That's very kind, a little hyperbolic, but that's okay, I suppose. And thank you, Greg, too. Thank you all for coming. It's good to be back in New England. I actually lived for 14 years on the North Shore of Boston, most of that in Salem, Massachusetts. So even though I'm originally from Philadelphia, I'm familiar with New England life. And there's something about New England religion and culture that has a very distinctive edge, is how I decided I would put it. But two quotes I wanted to give to sort of convey a sense of how that edge feels to me. One is from Van Wyck Brooks, who wrote, quote, "When the wine of Puritans spilled, the aroma became transcendentalism, and the wine itself commercialism." And related to that is a quote from a teenager I interviewed in a Congregationalist church near where I lived in Salem, Massachusetts. She loved her church. She loved her youth group. She was really into it, really involved, which is not necessarily typical of a New England teenager in a Congregationalist church. And finally I asked her, "What is it you love about this church so much?" And she said, without batting an eye, "Well, they don't talk about God too much here." Okay. Anyway, it is good to be here. I'm honored to have been invited to give this lecture. Thank you very much, Greg, for that again. And I hope what I have to say is interesting to you and useful for whatever your work is. One warning I'll give ahead of time is that what I have to say might depress any youth ministry people among you, and it will disgust any historians among you. You'll see why when we get to the point, but at least you historians know that I'm aware that I'm going to disgust you, which is better than just clueless sociologists saying things and the historians are going ballistic. So I have, for the last 15 years, been studying the religious and spiritual lives of American teenagers and young adults, which we call emerging adults in the literature. I've had a big study called the National Study of Youth and Religion, hence the NSYR, and we've collected 4 waves of survey and interview data on more than 3,000 parent-teen pairs in a longitudinal study. That is, we got them when they were 13 to 17 and have followed them as they've grown up. And in the 4th wave, which we just collected, they were 24 to 29. So it's a major empirical study of young people and their religious and spiritual lives and many other things about them. I published this first book in 2005 on the teenagers, soul searching. 5 years later, this book on 18 to 23-year-olds, souls in transition. Recently published a book on Catholics called Young Catholic America, emerging adults in, out of, and gone from the church. Also have another book on emerging adult culture, not about religion exactly, but called Lost in Transition, not to be confused with Lost in Translation. But there's a whole number of books have come out of this project. What I'm working on next is a study of parents and the intergenerational transmission of religious faith and practice. That's because back at this study, what we learned was how incredibly central parents were, how important parents were in forming young people's faith, lives, and practice, which once you realize that is sort of an obvious point. But there's so much about our culture and parents and children's experience that it's not entirely clear to all of us that that's the fact. But having learned how incredibly important parents are to sort of religious socialization of young people, I went back to Lilly Endowment and said, we've got to study parents, and they agreed. So I'm involved in this big project studying parents, interviewing them all over the country, different religious traditions and so on. I won't go into any of the methodology of that, but just to say, all of this grows out of a long, deep study of teenagers, then emerging adults, and now going back to look at parents and parenting. And what really turns out to be interesting is them not only talking about their parenting of their children, but their experience as children and their own parents, and sort of like from one generation to the next. It's really fascinating. I have to say, we're right in the middle of collecting data for this. It's not done. And I'm only at the very, very beginning of trying to make theoretical sense of it. So the second half of this talk is going to be highly speculative. And this morning when I was being picked up from my hotel, I was thinking, some of this doesn't even hang together. Like one statement I'm making is completely incoherent with another statement. So you're just going to have to put up with that relative incoherence. knowing that it's speculative. I'm at the very front end of trying to think through some of the implications of this, and actually interested in some of your thoughts about how it may fit together that I can't see myself. So the starting question is, which actors in the lives of American youth exert the greatest influence on their religious and spiritual lives? Is it clergy? Is it youth ministers? Is it their peers? Is it religious schools if they go to one? Is it their parents? Well, obviously the title of my talk gives away the fact that it is not these, it's the parents. Exerts by far and away the greatest influence on the religious and spiritual lives of young people, teenagers and emerging adults after they leave home, after they're gone from home. Parents, for better or worse, and many times it's for worse, are absolute, if you're concerned about the faith lives of young people, it would be for worse. Parents, for better or worse, are absolutely the most influential pastors, so to speak. This is the language I'm using in this talk, of their children. They define for their children the role religious faith and practice ought to play in life, which, very interesting, most children roughly adopt. Not all, it's clearly not deterministic. Some children turn out to be different than their parents or their siblings, etc. We all know that, we've experienced that. But in general, in rough generalization terms, most children roughly adopt something like what their parents look like, maybe less committed and involved. Another way to say this is parents set a kind of a glass ceiling of religious commitment above which their children rarely rise. So all of this matters a lot. In other words, the intergenerational transmission of religious faith and practice today, from my point of view at least, the key location of it is in the home, not religious congregations. The key agents are parents, not clergy or youth ministers, and the key mechanisms are the formation of ordinary life practices and identities, not programs preaching rites of passage and so on. This parental influence is significant for some reasons. So we have to understand why this actually feels a little odd, even if it's really Sociology 101, third lecture, culture and socialization. It should be obvious, but it's a little odd because many parents don't realize they still influence their teenagers. Many parents think, after age 12, she stopped listening to anything I said. Many teens believe that they are not influenced by anything, that they are autonomous information processors who make independent decisions for themselves. So they're both actors in this process, are not aware of what's really the power of what's really going on over time, and that's part of what makes this interesting to me. Also, there are widespread cultural scripts that say that parent influence recedes while peer, media, music, and social media influences take over. And there are other widespread cultural scripts that basically, in my view, disempower parents by telling them, you're not competent with your children, you need to turn your children over to experts, medical experts, education experts, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there are strong scripts in our culture disempowering parents, and to the extent that that feeds into this question of religious socialization, many parents feel like, I don't know anything, I'm not sure what I believe, and I feel awkward talking to my kids, and so on. So I think that there's this strong sense of parents really don't have much influence over the young people's religious and spiritual lives. And then, as some of you know quite painfully well, many religious parents operate on the model that someone else is actually responsible for forming their children religiously, whether that's Sunday school or youth group or confirmation or CC, that it's somebody else's job. And the worst expression of this, of course, is the parent who drops the kid off at the church building on Sunday morning and goes off to Dunkin' Donuts to read the paper, which in light of my findings is very problematic. But that sort of reflects this general sense, this part of their socialization is somebody else's job. Okay, in this talk I want to do two things. I want to examine some empirical research findings, so literally statistics. I'll focus on the conceptual nature of them and not the technicalities. But some empirical findings about parental influences on children's religious beliefs and practices. And then I want to reflect theoretically on what may be the sociocultural conditions that help to explain these findings. Again, this is the part that's speculative and somewhat incoherent, but we'll see. So first, empirical research findings. The first, I'm going to put before you maybe 4 different ways of approaching this, and the basic point is just to demonstrate empirically how important parents are in forming the religious lives of their children. The first way I want to do that is to say, let's look over a period of 10 or 11 years of young people's lives and see what kind of religious trajectories are they on, and then look at what associations there are between parents' religious faith and the different trajectories. So this is starting off 13 to 17-year-olds, tracking them all the way to 24 to 29-year-old. And I'm going to use a measure of religiousness that combines religious service attendance, importance of personal faith, and frequency of prayer. These are different dimensions of religiosity. I hate that term, but let's use it. Combines it into one measure. And I especially want to focus on older teenagers because different things happen in younger teenagers' lives. 15 to 17-year-olds, and then track them across 10 years and say, they're not all the same, clearly. So we have this statistical method called growth curve modeling that identifies empirically what are the major groups of trajectories that different teenagers are on. And the results look something like this. So you can see if you follow, oops, what in the world? Oh yeah, okay. You can see there about 25% of the 15, 16, 17-year-olds. So here's very low religion. Here's the top religion based on those three measures. About 25% are hardly religious at all, and 10 years later they're even less religious. Those are the just totally not religious kids. And then according to this, about 29%, which is shockingly high to me, but let's run with it, are 9 out of 12 scale of religious, and they pretty much stay highly religious. These are the very religious kids. They're raised religious, and they stay religious into their mid-20s. And then you have various trajectories of decline, a shallow decline, about 25%, a steep decline, about 13%, start off at 8 out of 12, and then really go down. They just bag out of religious faith and practice. And you have this very interesting group of 2% of teenagers start off not that religious at all and become just as religious as the most religious. So you might think of these as the nominally anything religious types who get really involved in, say, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in college, and then it changes their life sort of thing. So the point here conceptually is different young people are on different trajectories, and there are groups of them that tend to be similar in the kind of trajectories they're on. This is not my theoretical invention. This is driven by the actual data, how big, what kind of the trajectories are there that are significant and how large they are. And so then the next question we might have is, what differentiates people that are on this line, from this line, etc., right? What makes the difference is the next analytical question we might have. So what I want to do is focus on differences in the religious faith and practice of parents associated with their children being on one of these lines. So here you can see that 66% of those who are on the high stable, that's the dark line at the top, had parents who reported attending religious services weekly or more often. And 17% of the low declining had parents that were the same. So I'm not going to go through pedantically number after number, but you'll see the general pattern. The more religious, the less decline, the more the parents were highly religious themselves. So that's the parent attending weekly or more often. This is the parent attending with their teenager. So it's one question, how often do parents attend? The other is, do families attend together, or sort of people going off in different directions? And 87% of the teenagers who turned out to be on the high, strong religious trajectory had parents who attended religious services with them, not apart from them. Again, compared to these lower numbers for the low declining and so on. This is the same for parents saying that their faith is extremely important in their lives. Again, you can see the high stable as much more likely to have parents that said that than the low declining, et cetera, et cetera. This is another variable that turns out to be very important later, and the question on the survey is, do you and your family talk about religious matters at home during the week? That is, it's a distinction between church is one thing, religion talk there, and as soon as we walk out the door, we never talk about religious questions or issues or matters again until we're back in church. super compartmentalized. Versus some families, they talk about God and faith and whatever, somehow, at least some, during the week at home. And again, you can see those that are, sorry, there are too many buttons here. Those that are high stable have, the majority of them had parents who talked about religious matters at home, and very small numbers on these other categories had parents who talked about religious matters at home during the week. So you follow, that's the first thing, and that is which trajectory a teenager gets on as they move into their 20s is highly related or correlated to, and I would say causally driven by, the faith of different characteristics of the faith of their parent. Second way of approaching this, for you, those of you that know what this means, this is sort of standard regression models controlling for a whole bunch of factors that could be confounding and looking for the independent effects of a whole variety of what we call independent variables and mediating variables on emerging adult children's stronger religious faith and practice in their mid to late 20s. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but you can see, compared to conservative Protestants, having a parent who, as a teenager, the parent, when the parent had the child as a teenager, was mainline Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, with mainline Protestant being the strongest effect. These are standardized variables, so you can compare across them. The larger the number, the stronger it is negatively associated with that many years later being strongly religious. Parent and personal importance of faith is quite strong of direct effect. Two parents, similar religious faith is not, in this case. Parents monitoring children's behavior is. Parents' closeness to teenager is not, but parent involvement in activities at religious congregations is significantly related in a direct effect. And families talking about religious matters at home during the week is a very strong indicator, or has a very strong association or correlation with more robust religious faith and practice of children after they've left home, well, some 20-year-olds still living at home, but mid to late 20s. You got that? So there's all these separate, these are independent effects, net of each other, so to speak. These are independent effects. All of these variables are significantly related to this. And if you're into research methodology and design, what you're thinking now is, how could you be claiming parents are more important than other things when we're not looking at the other things? All right, that would be a great critical question. I'm just going to tell you, as a matter of fact, without showing it, that any other variable we could throw in here will get washed out by all these effects. Going on missions trips, service trips, youth ministry, Christian school, whatever, doesn't hold a candle to these variables. Okay? So these are very powerful. A couple other demographics. Being a girl, of course, is quite strongly related to staying more religious. Being Hispanic or black, etc. Now, I'm calling these mediating mechanisms because these are not sort of their own independent variables. They themselves are driven by, at least that's the way we talk about it, they're driven by some of these other more basic variables. So how important faith is to a parent will affect how much they talk about religion at home, right? Conceptually. That's why these are in the middle and not over here on the left. So what the next slide does, ideally these two would be superimposed upon each other, but there are too many arrows and it gets too complicated, so I disaggregated them. Next, what we show is how do these variables relate to these two variables? That is, do these have indirect effects on the outcome through the mediating variables? You get that conceptually? So, and the answer is yes, they do. Both, so mainline Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are less likely to talk about religious matters at home. That's one of the ways. There is both a direct effect and an indirect effect. Parents' importance of faith is very strongly related to the likelihood of talking about religious matters at home, which then gets transferred to the dependent variable, so to speak. And parents' importance of faith very strongly related to whether they're involved in religion. Now, all this is common sense. Parents who don't really care much about their faith are not going to be talking about it a lot at home and going to a lot of church activities. But the point of this is, again, all these effects would wash out many of the other effects, youth group, service trips, whatever. There are all these independent and powerful parent effects on this longer-term outcome when most young people have moved out of the home. So that's another way to sort of make the point empirically. Now, the point of this slide is to emphasize the importance of family talks about religion at home. So what we have here is wave one, that is when the youth are still teenagers, and here's the percentile. Here is each one of these. Here's the high end, and here's the low end. And here's wave four, that is when 10 years later, when they're out of the home in their mid to late 20s, this is the high end of them being very religious, and this is them not being religious. You can see that all of these factors have sort of the more in wave one that any of these pertained, the more religious 10 years later they will be 10 years later. But there are different steepnesses of slope. The more steep the slope is, the more of an effect that one of these variables has. And what's interesting to me, for example, you can see that parent importance of faith, which is the red X, and family talks about religion at home, which is the blue diamond, start off on the low end having sort of similar effects, and all the way up into the mid-range, the more religious faith is important to parents, and the more they talk about religion at home, the more later the teenager will be higher on their religion scale, so to speak, if you're following me. But right about here, at the 50 percentile mark, the parents' importance of faith plateaus, but we're talking about religion at home continues to be this sort of overwhelms every other factor. This has the steepest slope, the strongest association. So there's something about talking, just simply talking about religious things at home during the week that seems really powerful after the kids leave home, helping to turn them into sort of more committed and engaged in their religious faith 20-year-olds. You with me still? Okay. The last statistic I'll put out for you, and that's this. So it's very similar. This is combining. This is the combination of family talking about religious at home, parents' importance of faith, and parental religious activities, the same variables we looked at before. And here is the percent, this is the wave four. So the simple way to put this is 1% of those who in wave of young people, who in wave four, that is, who has 25 to 29-year-olds, 1% of them whose parents at wave one were in the bottom quartile of these religious measures ended up being at the high end 10 years later, 1%. It's nearly deterministic. 82% of those whose parents were in the top quartile are at the high end of religiousness. You see, that's a gargantuan statistical difference. That's when they're the combination of things. Now here, I've separated them out one by one, and you can see the differences are less. But when you start thinking about how do these things sort of concatenate when you combine them together, the differences are huge, and in some cases, nearly deterministic. I mean, there nearly is no chance that a young people is going to turn out to be very religious if in combination their parents are not strong on something, on these three factors combination. So you get that? The intention of this is just to convince you empirically, parents are huge determinants, so to speak, of the religious outcomes of their children over time. The last thing I want to do is break this out into religious tradition. So here we have later in there, this is the fourth wave when they're in the mid to late 20s. Here's the highest religious, here's the lowest. And we break it out into, I thought you might find this interesting, conservative Protestant, mainline Protestant, Black, Catholic, Jewish, Mormon, not religious. So here's I'm going to tell you what's important in here. Mainline Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish are adept at producing low religiousness emerging adult children. So I'm going to set Jewish aside because admittedly this survey and our whole it's nearly impossible to do a national project that pays adequate care to the particularities of each religious tradition. It's hard enough within Christianity, much less Judaism. So I really want to sort of bracket Judaism as its own thing and set that aside and not jump into that here. But still, I'll put it up for you to see. But if this is the religious tradition of the parent during the teenage year that we surveyed. And we can see here that 68% of the children when the parents said they were Catholic turned out to be in the bottom half of religiousness 10 years later. And 70% of mainline Protestant turned out to be in the bottom half. So that they're particularly capable of doing that. Next, Mormon and Black Protestant produced the strongest top half, quite large numbers, in the highest and moderate 10 years later. I mean, 61% Mormon, pretty impressive. It fits with what we know about sort of high demand, high intensity Mormon faith. What's really interesting too, though, is that Mormon and conservative Protestant actually produce relatively bimodal, polarized outcomes. So this all makes sense, right? In Mormonism, you can't say, I think I'll sort of do this. You either do it or you don't do it, right? So there's only 2% somehow ended up in this moderate. I don't know how they're getting away with that. But you're either at the high end or you sort of drop out to the bottom. You say, I'm just not doing this. And what's more interesting, though, is conservative Protestantism actually has, evangelicalism actually has that kind of effect. There's a pretty strong high end and there's a pretty strong low end, too. It's not quite as polarized as Mormonism, but there's also this which is to say, I mean, Catholicism actually is pretty decent at saying, if you want to land somewhere roughly in the middle, that's all right. You know, sort of doing this is acceptable. But when a tradition like Mormonism or conservative Protestantism says, no, you do this, seriously, then that ups the ante in a way that pushes some out to the low end. Does that make sense? You see what you follow? So there's variance across all this with traditions, and there are different quote-unquote strategies you might have that produce different kind of outcomes. All right, that's a little bit of a sidelight, but I thought you'd find it interesting. So relative to other influences, just to restate this, no other conceivable causal influence, not head clergy, youth pastors, youth group programs, mission service trips, religious schoolings, religious peers, anything, come remotely close to matching the influence of parents on the religious faith and practices of youth. Parents just dominate. Statistically, they wipe out all the other effects. There's no way to get rid of the parent effects in any statistical model. It's just huge.
And that's grandparents? You have grandparents?
This is just parents. Other studies show grandparents are also significant too, but they don't have the same influence. Of course, there are some households where if the grandparent there isn't a parent, so it gets messy in particular cases, but we're focused on the immediate parent figures. It doesn't have to be the biological, the parent figure. So it could be a grandparent or an aunt, but. Okay, so that's my first point. It's a purely empirical point. So what I want to do next is talk about some embryonic theoretical reflections, not just embryonic, but speculative, let's say. Not well worked out, but I wanted to put it out there for an interesting discussion, I hope. What helps to explain this situation? How do we explain the importance of parents? What might it tell us, and what might it tell us about American religion and culture? Could these findings tell us something about the broader sociocultural environment that religion is operating with in contemporary United States? So why parents? Well, there's some obvious answers, and an obvious starting point answer is that if we consider youth to be bundles of time, attention, energy, and activity, that they're packages of that in potential to be spent in different ways, and they're being formed to spend it in different ways. If you think about teenagers that way, then it's pretty obvious that parents simply have, and since day one, normally have had a massive advantage in access to youth in the life formation process. I mean, they've just had hours and hours and hours and weeks and months and years with people. So what the parents are, they just have more access in forming sort of the developmental sense of young people and what's real and how should I spend my time and what's valuable and who am I, et cetera, et cetera. In this sense, it's all very straightforward and obvious. more so than even schools, which gobble up increasingly a larger amount of kids' time and young people's schedule, and certainly more than churches and youth groups. If you view young people sort of as bundles of time, attention, energy, and activity, and everyone's sort of pulling up their guts to the table to get a piece of it, so to speak, family, school, sports, television, the internet gets lots and lots of chunks of pieces of this. And church is sort of sitting at the little corner end of the table like, wait, what about me? Let me get a little piece of you. So there's just not a lot of access, if we just think about it in terms of access to this developing thing called a young person. So that's, in some sense, that's an obvious starting point answer. Also, this makes sense, a subsidiary answer I think that's helpful to throw in here is that the stereotype of adolescent generation gap, Sturm and Drang, that is sort of storm and, the old teenagehood is when everything gets thrown up in the air and everything is chaotic and everyone's got to renegotiate everything and it's nothing but constant conflict and so on. Is largely baseless. I mean, lots of studies in the 90s that actually studied this showed most teenagers and their parents get on reasonably well, not great, but reasonably well, and most teens still look to their parents for guidance and help. So going all the way back to sort of Anna Freud and a lot of sort of images of rebellious youth that culminated in the 60s and early 70s, that was the experience, allegedly, of many baby boomers. One of the problems is that baby boomers, who had a huge, of which many of us are, I'm at the very tail end of baby boomers, some of you are baby boomers, had a huge influence on sort of our assumptions about how the world works. And there was this very strong tendency for baby boomers to project their generation's experience on everything, on everybody and everything else. So what happened, though, was Gen Xers and millennials turned out not to really be like baby boomers in this. They were much more not up against the system, but bought into the system, very happy to succeed within the parameters of the established order, and basically were okay with their parents, most of them. And but there's a sort of like hangover tendency, so to speak, of boomers to project generation gap thinking on young people that was just not appropriate for them. It's just not the way their lives were. So baby boomers should stop projecting their 60s youth rebellion mentality onto youth today. That would be a big help along the way here. Why talk? So I find this just talking about religious matters at home and the power of this variable to be really intriguing. And one obvious answer is that religious belief and practices are linguistically constituted and meaningful. I mean, without language, it would be very hard to do religion, right? So religion is central. I'm not a very super strong linguistic constructionist like everything is language. I'm not. I'm a realist, and language is only a subset of things. But still, language is really crucial in religious practice and formation and so on. And religious language is not mainstream America's first language. If we think of people have a first language and maybe they have a second language. Religious language, theological language, God talk is not most people's first language. You have to be maybe Amish or something for that to be your first language, or a seminary student, I suppose. But it's a second language at very best. And for many people, it's not a language they know. They have a few vocabulary words and that's it. And what we know about language learning is that, therefore, to learn and believe a practice, to learn and to believe and practice a religion requires essentially learning a second language, in addition to the dominant language or the primary language. To be a seriously religious person in this culture, even though we're not that hostile, religiously hostile of a culture, it does require learning a second language to actually be able to do it well. And what we know about language learning is you don't just sit down and read a book about it. It requires practicing it, speaking it, hearing it, and practicing speaking it oneself until it becomes more natural to oneself. And so therefore, that might help to explain partly why the talk variable is so important. If the only time a young person has to practice the language of religion is at church, they're not going to be very good at speaking it. And when they get out on their own, it may be very awkward or it seem irrelevant for them to speak it. But I suspect that there's something more of a story to be told about the meaning and sociocultural significance of the parent influence beyond these obvious things, and that's what I want to explore here. Why parents? Why at home? Why talking? So my thesis, and here's where the historians are going to start to melt down, is that the centrality of parents indicates a long-term transformation of the character of mainstream American religions vis-a-vis their sociocultural context. That is, things are changing in this society over the long run, and that changes sort of who's most naturally in charge of religious transmission of faith. So roughly, this is the language I'm tentatively using at the moment. The change roughly is, and I realize this is one of these horrible social science binaries, but from communal solidarity, religion as a communal solidarity project, to religion as a personal identity accessory. Okay? So I want to try to unpack this a little bit. First I want to start off give you 6 images, and I'm not going to give any commentary, I'm just going to give you the images that to me, convey something about what I'm trying to mean, even if I don't have it all figured out. So it's going to be from communal solidarity project to personal identity. Here's the communal solidarity project image. And here's the personal identity accessory image. This is actually a real Catholic church in Colorado. Not just. Notice the parking lot. From communal solidarity project, instruction, actually I said I wasn't going to give any, all right, I'm not, to personal identity accessory. This is the one not Catholic picture in here, but we know that American Catholicism is very much overwhelmed and formed by American Protestantism. So, from communal solidarity project to personal identity accessory. In this case, I specifically mean to bring it back to the home and the family. From here to here. Okay, now, I'm going to quickly run through this. I really am not going to unpack this because I don't have time, and I'm not sure what I would have to say anyway. Some of these are just ideas that struck me that I hope convey a sense of things. On the left side, on the middle column is the communal solidarity project description of what I think a religious world looks like, and on the right side is the personal identity accessory understanding. So what is a religious congregation when religion is a communal solidarity project? It is something like the center of faith's local community life. It's the center of the life, and it's a collective thing. When religion becomes a personal identity accessory, it ceases to be that and becomes more a supportive associational resource. Something that families can use as a resource if they wish to, sort of like the YMCA or lots of other things they might plug into. When religion is a communal solidarity project, what does the self need? The self needs something like formation in the good. There may be lots of different versions of how that formation happens and how the good is conceived, but essentially the idea is the self needs to be formed toward a good, whereas when religion is a personal identity accessory, the self needs to identify some life concerns, and I mean the word concerns in a strong, thick way here, like what we care about. Life concerns that are authentic to the self. That's what one needs to figure out. What do I really care about that's really me? And is religion a part of that or not? When religion is a communal solidarity project, religion's practical purpose is right living grounded in good beliefs, something like that. When religion becomes a personal identity accessory, religion's practical purpose is therapeutic coping practices, and it gives people ways, this is related to the moralistic therapeutic deism that Phil mentioned, gives people the ways to sort of cope with the difficulties and stresses of their life, of which we all have many, and helps people, especially young people, to make good choices. That means, if you would read my books, you would know what that means, but I'll just mention this. If you've seen the movie Freaky Friday, where the mother and the daughter switch bodies, and the daughter drops the mother, they drop off her school, and the mother says, make good choices. And so that sort of conveys a sense of what this is about, that it's a little bit different from right living grounded in good beliefs. Okay. What is a religious epistemology of these two? Well, on the one side, there's revelation, tradition, reason, experience. Of course, different traditions would work these out differently, and some kind of conditional trust in religious authorities. Not absolute trust, unless you're a Catholic of a certain era, but conditional trust. When religion becomes a personal identity accessory, the epistemology underlying all of this is more like individual personal opinion, and this is the word that many young people will use to describe their beliefs. It's not beliefs, it's opinion. And subjectively felt preferences, which is of course economistic, consumerist-oriented language, like you have this preference and so therefore you purchase these goods, etc. The social ontology of religion under the first is something like an authoritative carrier of a tradition, and under the second it's kind of an optional lifestyle accessory. It's like if you're going out to buy a truck or a car and you go to the dealer, if you're buying it really new, you get to say, oh, I want a sunroof, a moonroof, and I want this kind of, and so when somebody's putting together their identity in life now, religion may or may not be an accoutrement that they wish to have as part of their life. And that's the ontology of religion. It's something that you might have added to your life or not. Home and family and all this, under a communal solidarity project, the home and family are a crucial anchor institution. It's not the center and everything of it all, but it is an anchor that sort of keeps the whole ship connected somehow to something real. But in personal identity accessory, when religion becomes that, home and family becomes something more like an incubator of possibilities. Nothing is given, nothing is determined, but the parents are sort of giving to the kids, here's what we are, here's what we think we are, maybe, and here's what we hope you maybe want to be. It's a hothouse early on of sort of here's what's possible, explore, figure it out, and so on. I'll just leave it at that, hope it makes sense. The mode of growth in the first is participation, solidarity, and practice. You get involved, you're connected to something bigger than yourself, and you figure out some ways to practice it, one way or another. When religion becomes a personal identity accessory, the modes of growth are self-reflexivity, that is a continual monitoring of oneself, one's thoughts, one's beliefs, one's experiences, assessment of them, what do I think of that, and an expression of what one thinks is the right thing. A couple caveats. I realize this is grossly oversimplified. This whole thesis flirts with old, simplistic sociological dichotomies. Social science is beset with myriad 19th century, we used to be this and now we're this, which drive me nuts. And I realize that's exactly what I'm doing here. But I do think that there's something going on here that's real that I'm trying to sort of grope toward. I also realize that this thesis could be read, and I want you to be clear, wrongly as sort of, oh, in the good old days, the priest just told us what to believe, and that was the end of it. I mean, that's not how I'm saying it. I'm taking a much more neutral, things are just transforming. They probably are goods and bads of everything in one way or another involved. And different people of faith and different faith traditions can figure out what they like and don't like about this. But I want to mostly be saying, something like this kind of transformation I think is going on, is worth figuring out better. Also, there's variance across religious traditions and other variables clearly in that, for example, Mormons still are pretty strongly on the side of religion is a communal solidarity project. I mean, when you have to give up the 2 years of your life after high school and go to who knows where that you didn't choose to go missionize, that's a solidarity project, not a, I wonder if I want this in my lifestyle. Whereas mainline Protestant probably is in the far opposite extreme of religion as a personal identity accessory. Again, don't be insulted. Sociologists specialize in generalizations, so it's not the case in every, but the mainline Protestant parents we're interviewing mostly feel guilty if they think they're doing anything to direct their children toward their religion as opposed to any other possibility. There's a sense of like, should you tell your child that what I believe is right? That's oppressive somehow, and that's manipulative. So that's more along the lines of incubator of possibilities. Also, it varies by race. So African American religion of various sorts, in general, is going to be more friendly and comfortable with religion as a communal solidarity project. Whites are going to be much more the other. And it also varies by social class. This would actually take a lot of unpacking, but for those of you that know this literature. So there's a certain upper middle class ideal which combines autonomy with what some scholars call concerted cultivation as a way to raise children, that is combined with a certain concern with respectable status that will lead to a certain way of expressing all this religiously. Whereas working in lower classes are more oriented in general toward compliance, because that's how they have to succeed on the job. And there's a different general strategy of raising children called the sort of the accomplishment of natural growth, which I'm not going to explain. But that's also interconnected with a larger institutional disengagement of working in lower classes with any institution, including churches. So the middle and upper middle class are going to have a certain character, and then working in lower class are going to have multiple possibilities of characters. So it's more complicated is what I'm trying to acknowledge here. My thesis maps, if you know any of this, and I'm just going to burn through it very quickly, maps onto some existing models of things. So from Peter Berger's sacred canopy of a broad institutional religious plausibility to what I have called in a previous book sacred umbrellas. That is, when the canopy collapsed, there's still people can run around with their own sacred umbrellas, which are just their own little sort of worlds of consciousness that make sense to them, of individual belief, commitment, amid pluralism. From received tradition, this is the language of Margaret Archer and Anthony Giddens, to the self-reflexive imperative. And I'm not going to unpack this, but I just want to draw this connection to the talk at home variable. Margaret Archer has a book called The Self-Reflexive Imperative, and that there's something about the kind of culture and society we live in where you can't not be self-reflexive. It's part of who we are to monitor, adjust, et cetera, and so part of, if religion is a personal lifestyle accessory, the task of self-reflexive monitoring, and what does this mean to me, and how much is this part of my identity, et cetera, will be crucial to that. And if children are going to end up, when they're on their own, being seriously religiously committed, their parents are going to have to create a home environment where that kind of self-reflexivity and monitoring and so on goes on to help them work out as a self-reflexive, you must be self-reflexive person, work out, yes, this really is part of me, yes, this really matters to me. Phil Hammond has an interesting book, it's quite old now, but talks about the three disestablishments, from the formal constitutional disestablishment to the disestablishment of Protestant establishment hegemony to literally this establishment of institutional church authority. Like, church is not an authority, it's something we might participate in that I can draw on. It maps on to Arnold Gellin, James Hunter's talking about normative questions that can be in the foreground or the background, and when they're backgrounded, nobody even pays attention to them, they're taken for granted, but some questions are brought into the foreground, they have to be explicitly addressed and worked out and so on. So I'm saying in this context we're in now, a whole set of religious things are brought into the foreground, and if parents don't make sure they're addressed in a particular way, then it'll all fall by the wayside. Habermas, this is a bit of a stretch, but thinking about the difference between an inauthentic system, and I'm not going to explain this, it's only if you already know it, to a meaningful and humane life world. So religion increasingly gets put into the life world. Or from faith, I wish I had time to unpack this, but I don't. And this isn't even published, I just made this up when I was writing this. But from the faith reinforcements of complex institutional closure, and I'll just say by that I mean there have been certain times in American history when one's religious life, church, was connected to family, was connected to neighborhood and neighbors, was connected perhaps to school, normative Catholic schooling or something else, or public schools being normatively Protestant. In different ways, that is, the pieces are more connected to each other, which has a certain effect, as opposed to the model, the hub and spoke model, right? So here's the home, you go out to this, you go out to school, you go out to church, etc., of religious congregations as commuter plug-ins. And that's what I suggested by that empty parking lot Catholic megachurch in Colorado. Associated influences on all this are post-World War II suburbanization, the growing distrust by Americans of all social institutions for decades now. Just trust in any social institution of any kind, banks, the Pentagon, anything, has been down, down, down. In fact, religion has suffered the least, religious institutions have suffered the least of all that, but Americans just don't trust institutions generally. The growth of two-income paid labor force away from home households since the 70s, the diffuse cultural influence of postmodern suspicion, skepticism, and identity fluidity, and a decline in religious denominational loyalties. Lots of things going on, I think, feed into this process that I'm talking about here. I'm going to skip these two slides by Peter Berger, but just to say, Berger wrote a famously important book called The Sacred Canopy, which defines secularization theory. Most of what, and it's been since pilloried and rejected, but most of what he says in it is actually truthful and accurate and sheds light on what I'm talking about here. He just got some things wrong that made the whole thing go down the chute, but actually if we go back and reread Berger, there's tons there to be, that he was really right about, and this is 1967. But the last point I want to make here has to do with the idea of privatization in secularization theory. So for the longest time, secularization theory said simply, the more modern a society becomes, the less religious it'll become. The problem with secularization theory was that it conflated too many distinct concepts and processes all into this one idea. And so what we've done since the 80s is to differentiate the meanings of secularization. So one meaning is simply individuals, that is at the micro level, can't believe religious things anymore. That's one meaning. Another is that there's societal differentiation, that religion gets out of a lot of spheres that some people think are none of its business, and it sticks to the religious spheres, and other spheres do their own thing. And in some sense, there may be a decline of religious institutional authority. A third meaning is privatization. That is, the macro is compressed, that is, religious that used to be involved in all society gets compressed into just the home, into people's private lives. And that's often been talked about as the removal of religion from politics and public deliberation. All this, as we differentiate it, we came to see was historically path dependent, and it mattered if we were talking about France or the United States or Austria, right? So now, what we've decided is that societal differentiation has definitely happened. That's absolutely the case. If that's what we mean by secularization, that's happened. But widespread implausibility and unbelief hasn't necessarily at all. Lots of people still believe religious things, even though they're very modern. And this definition of privatization we've also decided isn't true. And Jose Casanova's 1994 book, Public Religions in the Modern World, was crucial in convincing us religion is all over in the public sphere, overthrowing communism and apartheid and just all sorts of things. It hasn't been entirely privatized. Now, what I want to suggest here is that the notion of privatization needs to be itself disaggregated into two ideas. So I'm suggesting that there are two distinct aspects of privatization. One is the macro, that religion is removed from politics and public deliberation. The other is the micro, that religion is psychologized as a lifestyle accessory and resettled in the privacy of home, family, and personal identity. And my main point is that we know that privatization of the macro kind hasn't necessarily happened in the world. But I'm trying to suggest here that privatization of the micro kind is happening in the world. And we used to think these were zero-sum games. The less public, the more it would be pushed into private. I'm simply saying that there are two different versions of privatization that are operating on their own tracks and don't. So the lack of privatization at the macro level is entirely compatible with the powerful privatization at the micro level. So perhaps we should reserve privatization, that language for religion becoming psychologized and domesticated as a personal lifestyle accessory, and reserve something else, I don't like this term, but depoliticization for the older meaning of religion moving from politics and the public deliberations. Back to the parents, and then I'm done. Religion morphing from a communal solidarity project to a personal identity accessory creates, I'm trying to figure out something like a sociocultural context in which the burden of religious socialization is laid primarily on the shoulders of parents. That is, if this is what religion is in this kind of society, who's responsible for passing it on? it travels almost all from what previously would have been many variety of institutions interlocking to basically the parents. It's the parents do it or the parents don't do it. Parents at home and not public communities are the ones who own matters of personal identity, choice, socialization. Discursive self-reflexivity becomes an imperative in this if things are going to work properly, so to speak, and religious communities become mere associational resources from which parents may draw help if they desire it. We have a grand total of 7 minutes for Q&A. I'm sorry that took so long, but I hope you found it interesting.